All right, it says it's recording. So I'm going to record it as well, and I'll send you the recording. Okay, so it'll have the whiteboard on it. But, you can take notes as we go as well. That way you don't have to watch the whole thing over. All right. So I'm going to kind of go through every chapter and outline kind of what kind of questions you can expect on your test. All right. So everybody understands that your test is a week from tonight, correct? All right. You go to the same room that you went to the first time, MCC 102 at 6 o'clock. You're going to need your student ID to get in the building. Okay. The building usually locks down about 5 o'clock. Okay. So if for some reason you don't have a student ID, you need to email me. All right. But just bring your student ID and come down to that room 102. All right. Now, only because I love you. All right. Here's what we're going to do. The formula sheet that was on Canvas that has formulas on it? Everybody nod if you know. We got it? I'm going to let you print it off and bring it with you to the test, and you can write anything on the back of it that you want to. But you better not write on the front. If you write on the front of that sheet, I'm going to consider you ungrateful, and I'm going to take it away from you, and you're going to do the whole thing from memory. Okay, so you can write anything on the back of the sheet you want to. You can write a prayer to Jesus. You can write calculator steps. You can, definitions. I don't care. It's your back of the sheet. All right, but here's what I don't want you to do. What I don't want you to do is to try to write minuscule and put everything on the back of the sheet, because if you do that, you spend your whole time hunting and you don't find anything. Are you with me? So the back of the sheet is more kind of in case of emergency, break glass. Okay, like, oh yeah, I knew that was the steps for the calculator to find binomial. Yeah, I knew that's how you did binomial P instead of binomial C. So you can write, so when you come to the test, bring your calculator, make sure it's got good batteries. You don't want it dying in the middle of the test. Bring that formula sheet with anything written on the back of it that you want to, and a couple of pencils and your student ID, because I'm going to ask to see your student ID. I have to kind of tell them I do that because I've only seen your face like twice. Is everybody with me? And brain cells are dying as I'm speaking. So I've got to make sure that it's actually you and not your smart twin that's taking the test. Okay. Now, I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. Let's pray that the gremlins aren't going to mess that up. Okay. All right. Give me a thumbs up. Can y'all see that white screen? Like if I do chapter 1, everybody can see it. All right. Now, chapter 1, see, it's having a bad day. Chapter 1, let's try it again. Let me stop sharing and share it again. Chapter 1 is mostly vocabulary. Okay. So you do have to know vocabulary. There's going to be vocabulary on it. Okay. So make sure you know things like, the definition of like population. These are the ones on that video from chapter 1. Make sure you know what a sample is. Make sure you know your types of sampling. All right. So remember that you've got random. That's where everything's got the same chance of being picked. You've got systematic. That's if like every 10th thing got picked. You've got stratified. That's where the things are divided into groups. Like if I divided the voting population up by religion and picked 10 out of each religion, that would be stratified. Cluster is when you're grabbing a group at a time. So maybe instead of interviewing individuals, I was interviewing families. Okay. And then convenience is just easy. It's terrible. All right. Make sure you know your levels of measurement. Okay. So that's that nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Can't spell today. Okay. So make sure you know your levels of measurement. All right. Remember, nominal is category only. And then a little bit more specific than nominal is ordinal. So that's where, you understand the order, but you don't know the differences between them. That would be maybe like car being a small, like a compact, a mid-size, and then a luxury. I mean, I know that's from small to big, but I don't know how much bigger it takes to get from a compact to a mid-size. Ordinal and ratio are usually the ones people get mixed up. the key there is you cannot have negative numbers on ratio. So that's why it says on the video that ratio has an absolute 0. So temperature would not be ratio because I can go below 0 on temperature. All right. So it would be interval but your weight would be ratio because you can't weigh a negative amount. Okay. So do make sure that you go back through and look over all that vocabulary kind of out of that chapter 1 and make sure that you're good on quantitative data is numerical. Qualitative data is usually words like hair color, all those different kinds of things out of chapter 1. All right. Now, chapter 2 is where it started getting what you think of as kind of mathy. All right. All right. So in chapter 2, the very first thing it had you do, in fact, chapter 2 dealt with a frequency table. So I might make you make a frequency table. All right. I'm going to ask questions off the table. So you're going to have to answer questions off of a frequency table. All right. Now, in other words, I might give you a list of numbers, like a 4 and a 10 and a 12 and a 15. I would not put them in order. Okay. I'm just putting them in order now for sake of easy. All right. Let's go back and make a 3. All right. So I might have you make a frequency table, say with a first class of 2 to 7. Okay. Then remember that you would have to have like class, and you'd have to have like frequency. Okay. So if the first class is from 2 to 7, so if this one stops with 7, of course, that one's got to start with 8. And as soon as you figure out that one starts with 8, then you know what your class width is. Because I might ask you, what's the class width of that table? Remember, you don't subtract horizontally. Your class width is not 5. You subtract vertically. Your class width on this table is 6. So you'd have to keep adding 6 and putting it underneath the number. So if I add 6, I would get 13. If I added 6, I would get 14. Now, the way I know when to quit is when all my data fits somewhere. So when I add 6, I've got 19. But see, my numbers go up to 22, so I've got to keep going. 20. And then when I add 6 more, I'm going to end up with 25. And now all my numbers fit somewhere. So like between 2 and 7, there are 2 numbers. Between 8 and 13, there would be 1, 2 numbers. Between 14 and 19, there would be 1, 2, 3 numbers. And then 20 to 25, there would be 2 numbers. And if you notice, if you subtract any 2 numbers vertically, you're going to get 6. So that's how you get that class width. I might ask you to find the midpoint of a class. Like if I said, what's the midpoint of the first class? Remember what you do. You take this lower limit and this upper limit, and you add them and divide by 2. So 2 plus 7, it would be 9. And when you divide that by 2, you'd get 4.5. Okay. Now, what you cannot get confused are limits and boundaries. Okay. Limits are the ones that are just sitting there. So if I said, what's the lower limit of, say, the third class? Well, lower means the smaller. So here's my third class. So my lower limit would be 14. That 19 would be the upper limit. But now if I said, what's the lower boundary of the third class? That takes a little work. So you may have to go back and look that back up. That would end up being 13.5. And remember, that's when you take the end of class 1 and the beginning of class 2 and you subtract them. And then you take that difference and you divide by 2. This is the number that gets added to these upper limits, like 7.5, 13.5, and so forth, and gets subtracted from the lower limits. Like 2 minus 5/10 would be 1 5/10. 8 minus 5/10 would be 7 5/10. 14 minus 5/10 that's where I got the 13.5, because it said lower. So sometimes people skim the questions, and that's where they get in trouble, when they skim. Okay. Because, if I ask you for lower and you give me upper, it's not right. Or if I ask you to do the third class and you do the second class, it's not right. If I tell you to use 2 to 7 as the first class and use something else, it's not right. So make sure that you read. So you've got to be able to make a frequency table and read a frequency table. Okay. Now, another thing you've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to make graphs and read graphs. Now, there are 5 different kinds that you're responsible for on your test. All right. The first kind is called a histogram. So when I say histogram, you should think bar graph. And on the horizontal scale, you have to put the boundaries. Another kind of graph I might ask you to do is called a frequency polygon. And when you hear, or when you read frequency polygon, you should think line graph. And on the horizontal scale there, you put the midpoints. So the way I used to remember it was bar graph and boundaries both started with a B. So the boundaries go on the horizontal of the bar graph, which is the histogram, and the midpoints go on the horizontal of the line graph, which is the frequency polygon. Then you might have to make a circle graph. All right. Then you might have to make what's called a stem and leaf plot. Now, all those come out of chapter 2. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the 5th one, but it's in the next chapter, and that's the box plot. And remember, on the box plot, you have to have 5 particular numbers. You have to have the lowest number, the highest number, the middle number, and then you have to have Q1, and you have to have Q3. Okay. So that's the 5 different kinds of graphs that you've got to be able to make, and you've got to be able to read for your test. And so chapter 2 is mostly frequency polygons, making them and reading them, and graphs, making them and reading them. So you had kind of problems out of the book, and you had web work problems on that. Okay. Now, if you've got a question so far, unmute and ask it for me. Does anybody have a particular question? Everybody okay? Give me a thumbs up. We good? Okay. Now, then we're going to move on to chapter 3. All right. Chapter 3. The first thing you got to be able to do is you got to do all your measures of center. Okay. And by that, you have to be able to get me a mean. And remember, there's 2 symbols for mean, mu and X bar. And you need to know the difference. Remember, X bar is the mean of a sample, and mu is the mean of a population. I'm just going to put POP. So you don't interchange those. So it matters which symbol you write down. All right. You've also got to be able, that's where you add the numbers up and divide by how many you've got. Okay. Then you've got to be able to find me mode. And remember, mode's the one that occurs most often. Okay. you've got to be able to find me the median. And just like in the highway, it's the middle. So remember, on the median, you put your numbers in order and you pick the middle number. Now, if you've got an odd number of pieces, there's just going to be one number in the middle. But if you've got an even number of pieces, there are going to be two numbers in the middle. Well, then you add them and divide by 2. Okay? And then you've got to be able to get me mid-range. Now, remember, with mid-range, all right, people get this confused. We'll talk about this in a second, but you take your high and your low and you add them and divide by 2. So when you hear mid-range, kind of think midpoint. Because when you remember when you got midpoint on your table, you added 2 numbers and divided by 2. Okay? Now, you've also got to be able to find me measures of variation. All right? So your measures of variation basically are, you've got to be able to find me your standard deviation. And you can do that with your calculator, okay? As far as if it's a list of numbers. We'll talk about a frequency table here in a minute. But if you've got a list of numbers, you can get the calculator to do standard deviation, okay? All right. Remember, there are 2 symbols for standard deviation. That's sigma and an S. And again, this is the one for the sample, and that Greek letter is the one for the population. So that matters which symbol you use. Okay. Now, you've also got to be able to do variance. Now, remember, variance, you just take your standard deviation and you square it. So if your standard deviation was 3, that means your variance would be 9. Okay. And then make sure that you can do range. Now, this is the one I want to make sure we're clear about. These two sound a lot alike. When it's range, you say high minus low and you quit. So mid-range and range both use the high and the low, but you subtract them on range and then stop. On mid-range, you add them and divide by 2. So if you think that's going to confuse you, or you might get them confused, that might be something around the back of your on your formula sheet. Okay. So this is things like if I gave you a list of numbers, and again, they would not be in order. Okay. You would have to put them in order. Okay. So if I gave you like 8 and 4 and 10 and 5 and 6, and I gave you another, I gave you a 3, and then I gave you, say, another 6. And I told you to find all these measures of center. The first thing you need to do is you need to put them in order. And I would put them in order from high to low, okay? Because you got 10, and you got 8, and then I've got 6, and I got another 6, and I've got a 5, and I've got a 4, and I've got a 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if I wanted to do mean, I would take my calculator and I would add all those numbers up. So 10 plus 8 plus 6 plus 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 3, and I get 42. All right. So I would take that 42 and I would divide by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when I do that, I'm going to get 6. Now, if it doesn't come out all pretty, you just round it off. Okay. Mode, I look and see if there's a number that occurs more than the others, and there is 6. Now, let's make sure we're clear. I'm gonna cross through this in a second. If there had been 2 3s and 2 6s, I would have had to write down 6 and 3. Okay, so you can have more than one mode. So it's not how many occur more than once. If all the numbers occurred 2 times each, you would write down no mode. Okay. Median, I go and I look and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It happens to be 6. Mid-range, I would take my high plus my low and divide by 2. So I'm going to get 6.5. Now, several of these turned out to be the same, but they could all be different. Okay. Standard deviation, remember, you would enter all these numbers into a list. Okay. Remember, to do that, you go to your stat key. You know, and you go down to your list and you enter all the data in the list. You know, then you go back to stat. And then you go over to calc. And you're choosing one variable stats. Now, when you do that, there's a notation. There's one that says SX and one that says sigma X. You make sure you grab the S one or I'm going to count it wrong. And don't put SX equals. That's Texas Instruments notation. You're just going to put S is a certain number. And then whatever you get for your standard deviation, you would square it to get your variance. And then like your range here would just be 10 minus 3, you'd get 7. Okay, so make sure that you can get your measures of center and your measures of variation for a list of numbers. Okay, everybody okay on that? Now, the third thing on chapter 3 is measures of relative standing. All right, so the first thing you got to be able to do is you got to be able to get me a z-score. Now, this is the formula that's on the sheet, but it's in a weird place. It's down under chapter 6. So remember, z is x minus x bar over s. And you better write yourself a note. This is the only thing I care about rounding is on this z-score. I want you to round to the hundredths because that's going to help you on the final exam. So we're going to get in the habit of rounding to the hundredths. Okay. Everybody all right? The other thing you've got to be able to do besides z-scores, all right, you've got to be able to, let's see how they do it. You've got to be able to do percentiles and quartiles. Now, I can go 2 different ways. Let's make sure we understand the difference. All right, let's go back to a list of numbers for a minute. I have no idea. I don't remember. All right, suppose that was my list of numbers. Okay. What I might do is say, what percentile is 8? Now, this is the reason I told y'all to go from big down to small. Because I look right here, percentile is what's smaller than you. So before I even started this, I would have an estimate in my head, maybe 70%, 90%, 80% or below you. Okay. So remember what you do. You count how many numbers are smaller than this number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you divide that by your total number of pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you multiply that by 100. All right. So if I took on my calculator, if I took 5 and divided by 7, looks like I get about 0.71429 if I round it. And when I multiply by 100, I get about 71.4. So that would mean this would be the 71st percentile. Now, you can write a P and put a subscript of 71, but don't put 71%. They didn't ask you to change it to a percent. They asked you to change it to a percentile. And see, that matches what I thought, around 70%. Okay. So sometimes I'll give you the number and I'll want the percentile. Sometimes I'll give you the percentile and want the number. I'll go the other way, like find P sub 25. Now there, I'm thinking I'm going to be down here somewhere. So about 25% of my numbers should be below me. So I should be somewhere down in this side, not up in here. Remember, the first thing you do is you find your locator number. And your locator number is your percentile over 100 times your total. Okay? So what this does is turn your percentile back to a decimal. And then we said we had 7 numbers. Okay? So if I do 0.25 times 7, I get 1.75. Now, on locator numbers, you might write this on the back of your on your formula sheet. You always round up on locator numbers, not off. So my locator number is a 2. But even if this locator number had been 1.15, I still would have gone up to 2 because I'm rounding up. I'm not rounding off. Now, your locator number is not your answer. It says pick the second number. So make sure you start counting it with the smallest. So 1, 2. So my answer is 4. And see, that matches. That's about 25% below me, about a fourth of the numbers. Okay. So make sure that if I give you the number, you can give me the percentile, or if I give you the percentile, you can give me the number. And then remember that quartile 1 is the same thing as P sub 25. So instead of saying find P sub 25, I could have said find Q1. It's the same question. The second quartile is the 50th percentile, and the third quartile is the 75th percentile. But that's easy to remember because think in pennies and quarters. 25 pennies is 1 quarter, 50 pennies is 2 quarters, and 75 pennies is 3 quarters. Okay? So that takes care of chapter 3 when it's a list of numbers. Okay? Now, the last thing in chapter 3 deals with that frequency table. Okay? So if you have a frequency table, now I'm going to do a real small one. Okay? I'm going to ask you to find the mean and the standard deviation of a frequency table. These formulas are on your formula sheet, and you must use the formulas on the formula sheet. You can't just get the calculator to do it. Okay? So for instance, your formula on your formula sheet, if you go look at it, it basically tells you when you're doing a frequency table. Now in your book, let me see where it is in your book. Okay. All right. Your formula for mean of a table, let's see where they put it in your book. It's on page like 88. Okay. All right. It's on your formula sheet though, if you got your formula sheet. Remember, it's the sum of F times X over the sum of F. Well, now F stands for frequency. Well, every time the whole semester when you see X, X is data. But see, I don't have my original data anymore. If I had a list of numbers, I would have my data. So on a frequency table, remember, X is your data, but on a frequency table, that's your midpoint. So do we understand? I would say 10 plus 12 is 22 divided by 2, and I would get 11. I would say 13 plus 15 is 28, divided by 2 and get 14. 16 plus 18 is 34, divided by 2 is 17. That's my X's on a frequency table. So do we understand? I would say my frequency of 3 times that midpoint of 11, plus, then I would say 2 times the 14, plus, then I would say 4 times the 17. Now, the way I know how many numbers must have been the original list, I have to add these frequencies up. Excuse me, over here. So there must have been like 9 numbers in the original list. Okay. So if I do that 3 times 11, and then I do that 2 times 14, and add all those up, let's see what we get. Looks like I get 129. So if I get 129 and divide it by 9, looks like I get about 14.3. And that makes sense because, see, my numbers were all going between 10 and 18. And they were pretty evenly divided. So that answer makes sense. It's not negative, it's positive. That's just a dash. But that formula is on your sheet. Now, the other formula you need is on your sheet is the standard deviation formula. Now, it's longer. Now, I'm not going to take time to work it all the way out, okay? But I do want to make sure we're clear about kind of how to do that. And again, that's in your book and it's on your formula sheet, okay? So remember, it says n, and then you've got the sum of f times x squared, and then that bracket's closed, minus, then you've got the sum of f times x, and then the squared's outside the bracket. And all that is over n times n minus 1. Now, every time you see n the whole semester in a formula, it's your total. And every time you see x in a formula all semester, it's your data. Okay? So here, n is not my number of classes. I get that a lot. N is how many numbers were in the original list. So it must be 9. So on this frequency table, to get your n on a frequency table, it's the sum of your frequencies. And that gets missed a lot. If you put 3, you're going to get a negative number, and you can't have a negative number. Now, the difference here is where the squared is, but it makes a difference. See, if I go inside here, I can do an exponent or multiply. Well, I've got to do exponents first. So I'd have to go up here, and I would have to take all those x's and have to square them. So I'm going to get 121. Okay? If I do 14 squared, I get 196. If I do 17 squared, I better get 289. So when I do f times x squared, you understand my frequency is 3 and my x, so I'd be doing 3 times 121 and getting that answer, and 2 times 196. And then I'd be having 4 times 289. And I would take all those answers and add them up, and that would go right there in that bracket. Now that's different than this one. On this one, I just do f times x. So I just do like 3 times 11 and 2 times 14 and 17 times 4. And I would add those up, and I would put it in this bracket, and then I would square at the end. Okay, so the order that you do things matters, and that takes care of chapter 3. Okay, anybody unmute if you've got a question. Anybody got a question about something we went over? Everybody okay? All right, now I'm going to do chapters 4 and 5 kind of sort of a little bit together. Okay, chapters 4 and 5 are the ones that seem to cause people the most trouble because you don't have a background in probability. All right, so I'm going to do chapters 4 and 5 together. And what I'm going to do is talk about all the things I can ask you to do. I can ask you to find a probability. Now, every time somebody's not getting them right, they're not writing enough words. I don't read the word problem and then start putting numbers on my paper. All right, if you go back and look at those videos, I wrote words for a long time before I ever wrote numbers down. Okay? So the first kind is just one thing, one time. All right, it might be something like you pick one card. What's the chance you get a heart? All right, if it's just one thing, one time, remember the total goes on the bottom and what's in parentheses goes on the top. So like if I said, you pick one card, what's the chance you get a heart? Remember your total goes on the bottom. There are 52 cards. What's in parentheses goes on top. Okay, so make sure that you can do that one thing, one time. Make sure, because see, if it's a probability problem and you don't have a P in what you're looking for in a parenthesis, I won't give you any partial credit. Now, if you haven't finished chapter 5, this is not going to make a lot of sense to you. The next thing I look for is binomial, because I think binomial is easy because the calculator does all the work. But remember, for it to be binomial, it can only have 2 categories, and the chance of you getting the probability of a category has got to be the same for the whole problem. So the calculator does all the work, but you've got to either pick binomial PDF or you got to pick binomial CDF. The P one is when there is one number next to X. CDF is when you've got a list that starts with 0 next to X. Okay? Not just a list. If the list starts with 4, you can't use either of those keys, and the video tells you what to do, but I'm not going to go over that yet because some of y'all haven't. If I looked at web work, a lot of y'all hadn't even gone anywhere near chapter 5, which means you're behind. Okay? So you got to be able to do binomial problems. Then you got to be able to do connector words. And again, these formulas are on your sheet. Remember, you've got OR. That's where you add and then subtract the overlap. You've got AND. Now, if you don't ask yourself, is it possible, you're going to get nailed on the test next week. Because, for instance, if I let you pick one card and I say, what's the probability that you get a heart and a black card? And you're picking one card. If you grab that formula for AND, you're going to get the wrong answer. You shouldn't grab your formula for AND. Before you grab that multiplication formula, you're supposed to ask yourself, is it possible? And if the answer is no, your answer is 0. See, if I pick one card, there's no way it's a heart and black. That answer is 0. I'm finished and I go to the next problem. Now, if I let you pick 2 cards, then you can do it. That's when you do the probability of a heart times the probability of a black. All right, but you only grab that formula if it's possible. And I will say with replacement or without replacement. So with replacement, remember, means that when you pick, you put it back before your next pick. Without replacement, I mean once it's picked, it's gone. And then your connector word is given that. So one thing I can ask you is to find a probability. So if the problem tells me to find a probability, my mind kind of goes, okay, is this one thing, one time? If it is, I do it and I move on. If it's not, I say, well, is it binomial? If it is, then I use binomial. If it's not, then I look for a connector word. Another kind of problem I'm going to ask you to do is to find a total. How many codes can you make? How many phone numbers are there? How many lottery tickets? How many ways can I line up children at a door? So remember, the three I went over are the counting principle, all right, permutations, and then combinations. And remember, combinations is the one where order does not matter. And that's the calculator does that, because this formula is programmed into your machine, but you got to know where to go get it. Remember, on both of these, order matters. And if you're not sure which one to pick, always pick the counting principle. Because the counting principle can handle replacement or no replacement. The counting principle can handle special conditions or no special conditions. So you never have to actually use permutations if you don't want to. If order matters, grab the counting principle. If order does not matter, then go use combinations. Okay? So that's two of your questions that you need out of chapters 4 and 5. All right, let me clear that. Another thing that I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to find odds. And remember, there's two kinds of odds. You can have odds in favor of an event, or you can have odds against an event. Now remember, probability's got to be a number between 0 and 1, but odds don't. So as soon as I see odds, I always know I got to have the probability that I will have something and the probability that I will not have something. So if I said something like, what are the odds against picking a 5 from a deck? So that's that I will get a 5 and I will not get a 5. Well, remember, what's the chance when you draw a card, it's a 5? Well, the total is 52, and there are 4 5s. There's a 5 of clubs, a 5 of spades, a 5 of diamonds, and a 5 of hearts. And that reduces to 1/13. So remember, either I get a 5 or I don't. These are complements. So the way you know a complement, the chance of you not getting a 5 is 1 minus the probability that you will get a 5. And 1 minus 1/13, remember you have to have a common denominator, is 12/13. So the chance I will get a 5 is 1/13, and the chance I won't get a 5 is 12/13. Now, odds have to have both of those fractions. Now I care whether it says in favor or against, because if it says in favor, will goes on the top. 1/13 would go over 12/13. Remember, if those bottom numbers match, they just go out, and I would have 1 to 12. But if it had said odds against, the not goes on the top. So those bottom numbers would go out, and I would have 12/1. You cannot have decimals, and you cannot have a single number. So odds have to be 2 numbers. I wouldn't just put 12 there. I'd have to have 12/1. Okay, so you might have to find odds. All right. Another thing you have to find is you have to find mean and standard deviation. All right. And it's got to be a probability distribution table, or it's got to be a binomial problem. And again, if you haven't finished chapter 5, that's not going to make any sense to you. Now, remember, you have those probability distributions. They look like frequency tables, but they have X's and P of X's. So you have some X's over here, maybe a 1, a 2, a 3. Then you got some probabilities over here. Okay. Now remember, for something to really be a probability distribution table, when you add up these probabilities, you have to get exactly 1 or it's not a real table. And the formula for the mean and the standard deviation for a probability distribution is on your formula sheet. And the formula for binomial is also on your formula sheet. Okay. And that's all the different things out of chapters 4 and 5. Anybody got a question? Okay. Now, let me make sure we're clear about something. You've got to be able to find mean, standard deviation, and variance for a list of numbers. The calculator will do that. It'll find the mean and the standard deviation for a list if you want it to. Then you just square your standard deviation. For a frequency table, remember that's a formula on the sheet. Remember here I used calculator. You've also got to be able to find it for a probability distribution. And again, that's on the formula sheet. And you got to be able to find it for a binomial problem. And again, that's on the formula sheet. So make sure that you get those straight, because you can be asked to find mean, standard deviation, and variance lots of different ways. Okay. Now, the one other graph that came out of chapter 3 was that box plot. You know, that's where you go get, remember, the low, say the low is 6, and then you go get the high. Maybe the high was 20, and you go get the median. Maybe the median ended up being like 10. Then you had to get Q1, that's P sub 25. You had to get Q3, that's the same thing as P sub 75. You know, maybe P sub this one, maybe it was a 7. Maybe P sub 3 ended up being like 18. Remember, that's the one where you have this number line. I've got to see your scale. So my numbers are going from 6 to 20. You know, maybe I'll go up by 5s. 5, 10, 15, 20. I got to put all of these numbers on here. Well, let's try this. There's my 6, there's my 7. There's my 10, there's my 20, there's my 18. Remember, you put bars over the middle 3 and bars over those. Remember, the 3 in the middle go together to make the box. And then the whiskers, you know, you do that. So remember your 5 kinds of graphs. Okay. Now, the one other thing that you've got to know, all right, and this, I believe, comes out of chapter 3, is you've got to know the percentages on a normal curve. Okay, we're going to do, most of your final exams going to deal with a normal curve. So you've got to know that between the mean minus 1 standard deviation and the mean plus 1 standard deviation, 68% of your numbers are between there on a normal distribution, normal curve. And from your mean plus 2 standard deviations and your mean minus 2 standard deviations, 95% of your data is between those two numbers. And if you go to 3 above and 3 below, 99.7% is between those two numbers. So make sure you understand about, it's, again, you can go rewatch the video if you've forgotten what I'm talking about on this. Okay. So make sure that we're clear. There is vocabulary over your test. You should know what mutually exclusive events are. You should know what independent and dependent events are. So you should know what's the symbol for the mean of a population. What's the symbol for the standard deviation of a sample? So make sure you do study vocabulary in addition to working the problems. Okay. So that is a super quick 1 hour zip through all, half of a semester's worth of material. Okay. Now, all right. So here's what I'm going to do. All right. Let me double check and make sure if somebody left. All right. So left. Sarah Beth came in. All right. Let's see what we got. All right. Now, I'm going to repeat a couple of things because a couple of you came in a little bit later. When you come in to the test, you can bring a formula sheet that's clean on the front with anything you want written on the back. All right, but don't write on the front. If you write on the front, I'm going to take it from you. So when you come in next Thursday night, you have to have your student ID to get in the building, but also for me to give you your test. So bring your student ID, bring your calculator, make sure it's good, bring your formula sheet and some pencils. You don't want pens unless you're perfect. Okay. Now, does anybody have a particular question? Like everybody unmute for a second. Okay, so everybody unmute. Now, all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a second to ask a question. Then if you've got a particular question like, can you work number 14 on page 196? All right, you can stay on. Is everybody with me? And if you don't have a question, but somebody else does, and you just want to watch, you're welcome to stay on. But the mandatory portion of the Zoom is over. Okay. So I'm going to stop recording. All right. And I will send everybody a link to the recording in case there's something that, you wanted to